There is a quiet assumption woven deeply into modern culture, so subtle that most people never question it, yet powerful enough to shape how we judge one another without hesitation. If someone is not visible, they must be insecure. If they're not posting their face, their life, their victories, then something must be missing. And I have seen this assumption play out too many times to dismiss it as harmless. It changes how people interpret silence. It changes how they interpret restraint. It changes how they interpret those who simply choose not to participate in the constant performance of self. But what if the conclusion itself is flawed from the beginning? What if the absence of visibility does not point to a lack of confidence, but to a different relationship with value altogether? Most people have been conditioned, slowly and effectively, to confuse attention with worth, not because they are shallow, but because the systems around them reward visibility in very predictable ways. The more you are seen, the more you are acknowledged. The more you are acknowledged, the more you are reinforced. Over time, a quiet equation forms in the background of the mind. To be seen is to matter, and once that equation takes hold, it becomes difficult to imagine any other way of existing. This is where the misunderstanding begins, because it assumes that everyone is still playing that game. It assumes that everyone is still measuring themselves through external reaction. But that is not always the case. There are individuals, often the ones who observe more than they speak, who begin to notice something unsettling about this dynamic. They notice how quickly identity becomes shaped by response. They notice how easily a person's sense of self can rise or fall based on something as fragile as approval. I remember watching someone who once shared everything, every thought, every moment, every version of themselves offered openly, as if transparency itself was a virtue. At first, it looked like confidence. People admired it. They called it authenticity. But over time, something changed. The same person began to hesitate, not out of fear, but out of awareness. They had started to see the pattern. They noticed how people responded differently depending on what they revealed. They noticed how certain parts of them attracted praise, while others invited silence or subtle judgment. And in that realization, a question emerged that most people never ask. If the reaction changes based on what I show, then who exactly am I becoming in the process of being seen? That question does not lead to more visibility. It often leads to less, because once a person becomes aware that attention is not neutral, that it shapes behavior, perception, and even identity itself, something in them begins to pull back. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. They begin to choose what remains unseen. They begin to notice that not every part of their life needs an audience to be valid. And from the outside, this shift is almost always misunderstood. People see the reduction in visibility and assume something is wrong. They assume confidence has been lost. But from where I stand, that interpretation misses something essential. What if nothing was lost? What if something was recognized? Because there is a difference between wanting to be seen and needing to be validated, and most people never separate the two. The person who needs validation will always be drawn toward visibility because their sense of worth depends on it. But the person who begins to understand their own value at a deeper level often becomes more selective, not because they are unsure of themselves, but because they no longer feel the same urgency to prove anything at all. I have seen this pattern enough to recognize it when it appears. The quieter someone becomes, the more deliberate their presence tends to be. Not absent, not withdrawn, deliberata. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because once you stop assuming that visibility equals confidence, a different interpretation becomes possible. The person who shares less may not be hiding. They may simply be finished negotiating their worth in public. If you look closely at those who choose privacy, especially those who are emotionally perceptive, you begin to notice that their restraint is rarely random. It is patterned, it is deliberate, and more often than not, it is learned. There is a moment, sometimes gradual and sometimes abrupt, when a person who once shared openly begins to understand something most people overlook. Exposure is not a neutral act. It is an invitation, and not everyone who accepts that invitation arrives with clean intentions. I have watched this shift happen in people who used to believe that openness guaranteed connection, that honesty would be met with honesty, that revealing more of themselves would naturally lead to deeper understanding. For a while, it seemed to work. They were seen, they were responded to, they felt engaged, but over time, subtle fractures began to appear. Certain disclosures were met with curiosity that felt slightly off. Some responses carried undertones of comparison, even quiet judgment. And occasionally, something more unsettling surfaced. Moments where what had been shared in trust was later used as leverage, reframed, or quietly exploited. It is in these moments that perception sharpens. An empath, especially one who has experienced this kind of pattern more than once, does not simply register the event. They absorb it. They analyze it, they replay it, not because they are dwelling, but because their mind is trying to understand the mechanics beneath the interaction. What exactly just happened? Why did that feel different from what was said on the surface? And eventually, a realization forms, not as a dramatic conclusion, but as a quiet adjustment in how they move through the world. They begin to see that when you reveal something personal, it does not remain contained within your own intention. It enters the interpretations of others, and interpretation is unpredictable. It carries bias. It carries projection. It carries the unseen emotional states of the observer. This is where privacy begins to change, meaning, for someone less sensitive to these undercurrents, sharing might feel casual, almost weightless. But for an empath, each act of exposure carries an awareness of consequence, not exaggerated, not imagined, but anticipated based on lived experience. They start to recognize that not everyone observing them is simply observing. Some are evaluating, some are comparing, some are storing information, and some, whether consciously or not, are searching for points of entry. Once this becomes clear, privacy stops being optional. It becomes structural. It becomes a boundary that protects not just information, but psychological integrity. This is where many people misinterpret what they see. They notice the empath becoming more reserved, more selective, less accessible, and they assume withdrawal. They assume fear, but what they are actually witnessing is refinement. The empath is no longer distributing access equally. They are discerning. They are deciding, often without announcing it, who gets proximity and who does not. And that decision is not based on arrogance. It is based on pattern recognition. It is based on having seen enough to understand that openness without discrimination leads to depletion. I remember speaking with someone who described this transition in a way that stayed with me. They said there was a time when they believed being fully open was a form of strength, that holding nothing back made them real. But after a series of experiences where their openness was misunderstood, redirected, or quietly taken advantage of, they realized something that changed everything. Being open to everyone meant being shaped by everyone, and they were no longer willing to surrender that much control over who they were becoming. So they did not close off, they recalibrated, they became precise. Certain parts of their life remained visible, but others were kept intentionally out of reach, not hidden in fear, but placed where they could not be casually handled. This is the part that is often missed entirely. Privacy, for an empath, is not the absence of connection. It is the protection of meaningful connection. It ensures that what is shared is received by those capable of holding it without distortion. It preserves the parts of the self that would otherwise be fragmented under too many interpretations. And once a person begins to understand privacy in this way, it no longer feels like restriction. It feels like control in the most essential sense of the word, the ability to decide what remains yours and what is allowed to be seen. There is a subtle shift that happens in a person when they begin to notice the difference between living a moment and presenting it. And once that shift becomes conscious, it is almost impossible to return to the previous way of moving through the world. Most people never pause long enough to detect it because the behavior has been normalized to such an extent that it feels natural, almost expected. Un moment occur, something beautiful, something meaningful, and almost instantly, part of the mind turns outward, asking how it might be captured, framed, or shared. It is no longer just an experience, it becomes potential content, and I have watched this pattern closely enough to recognize what it does over time. It divides attention. It splits presence. One part of the person remains in the moment, while another part steps outside of it, evaluating how that moment will appear once it is seen by others. For someone who is deeply attuned to internal and external signals, that division is not subtle. It is felt. It creates a kind of tension that is difficult to ignore, as if something real is being interrupted by something performative. And many empaths begin to resist that interruption, not as a conscious rebellion at first, but as a quiet preference that grows stronger with experience. They begin to notice that the more they think about how something looks, the less they feel what it actually is. They notice that when attention shifts toward managing perception, something essential begins to thin out. The moment becomes less immersive, less complete, almost as if it is being filtered before it is fully lived. And once that awareness takes hold, a question begins to form beneath the surface. What am I losing when I turn experience into display? This question is rarely answered in words, but it reshapes behavior all the same. I remember observing someone during a simple interaction, nothing dramatic, just a conversation that gradually deepened into something real. There was a point where the exchange became unexpectedly meaningful, the kind of moment people often feel compelled to capture, to mark, to externalize in some way, but they did not reach for anything. They did not interrupt the flow. They stayed fully inside it, attentive, present, unfragmented. Later, when I asked why they did not share it, they gave an answer that was not rehearsed, not philosophical, just direct. They said that the moment did not need witnesses to exist, and that preserving it privately allowed it to remain intact. That response stayed with me because it revealed something most people never articulate. Not everything gains value when it is seen. Some things lose clarity the moment they are translated into performance. Empaths tend to understand this intuitively because they are sensitive to the difference between what is experienced and what is displayed. They recognize how quickly the act of sharing can alter the nature of the experience itself. It introduces an audience, even if that audience is not physically present. It introduces anticipation of reaction, which subtly reshapes behavior. And over time, if this pattern repeats, a person can begin to live in reference to observation rather than in direct contact with reality. The experience becomes secondary to its presentation, and that is where many empaths begin to disengage, not from life, but from the performance layered on top of it. This does not mean they reject expression entirely. It means they become selective about when expression serves the experience and when it interferes with it. They begin to value moments that remain unmediated, untouched by the need to be interpreted, appreciated, or validated by others. A quiet conversation, a personal realization, a sense of peace that does not require acknowledgement. These are not diminished by the absence of an audience. If anything, they are strengthened by it, because attention remains undivided. It stays where it belongs, within the experience itself. Over time, this orientation changes how a person moves through the world. They become less concerned with how life appears and more engaged with how it feels. They stop organizing moments around potential reactions and start inhabiting them fully, without splitting their awareness between being and showing. From the outside, this can look like disengagement, as if they are participating less. But that interpretation misses what is actually happening. They are not withdrawing from life. They are stepping out of a layer that distorts it. And once that layer is seen clearly, it becomes difficult to justify returning to it. There is a version of the empath that most people never see, not because it is hidden, but because it existed before the shift, before the recalibration, before experience forced a deeper level of understanding. That version was open in a way that felt natural at the time, expressive without hesitation, willing to explain, to share, to make itself accessible in the belief that sincerity would be recognized and met with equal care. And for a while, that belief holds. It creates connection. It invites response. It gives the impression that openness is always safe, always rewarded. But patterns reveal themselves slowly, and they rarely announce their presence until enough moments have accumulated to form something undeniable. I have seen this happen in people who did nothing wrong except assume that others approached them with the same clarity of intention. They spoke honestly, offered personal insight, allowed others to see parts of themselves that were not rehearsed or protected. And then something shifted, not all at once, not in a single event, but across a series of interactions that began to carry a different tone. A confidence shared in trust would later reappear in a different context, slightly altered, slightly out of place. A vulnerability expressed in good faith would be met with curiosity that lingered too long, as if it were being examined rather than understood. And occasionally, something more direct would occur. A moment where openness was not just misunderstood, but used, not always maliciously, not always intentionally, but used in a way that left a trace. That trace matters. It accumulates, and for someone who processes emotional experience deeply, it does not disappear quickly. It is studied, revisited, connected to other instances until a pattern begins to take shape. The realization that follows is rarely dramatic, but it is precise. Not everyone who has access to you is there to protect what they find. Not every interaction is as neutral as it appears. Not every question is asked without motive. Once this becomes clear, something fundamental begins to reorganize internally. The empath does not stop caring. They do not become indifferent. but they begin to understand that openness, when unstructured, invites consequences they can no longer ignore. This is where reduced exposure begins, and it is often misread. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal, like a person becoming distant or guarded, but that interpretation assumes that the previous level of openness was sustainable, that it did not carry a cost. In reality, what is happening is closer to correction. The empath is adjusting their behavior to match what they have learned. They are no longer offering access without evaluation. They are no longer explaining themselves to people who have shown, through subtle or direct behavior, that understanding is not their intention. And perhaps most importantly, they are no longer placing their internal world in environments where it is repeatedly mishandled. I remember a conversation with someone who described this transition in a way that clarified it immediately. They said there was a point where they realized that every time they left an interaction feeling drained or slightly altered, it was not random. It was information. It was feedback about where they had allowed too much access. And once they began to treat that feeling as data, instead of something to ignore, their behavior changed. They did not become closed. They became selective. They started choosing where to invest their presence, where to speak, where to remain quiet, where to share, and where to keep something entirely for themselves. It was not a retreat, it was a reallocation. This is where the idea of self-respect enters, not as a concept, but as a structure. Self-respect is often misunderstood as confidence or self-assurance. But in practice, it is expressed through decisions. It is visible in what a person allows, what they decline, what they engage with, and what they step away from without explanation. For the empath who has learned through experience, reduced exposure becomes one of those decisions, not because they fear being seen, but because they understand the cost of being seen without discretion. They recognize that access is not neutral. It shapes interaction. It influences perception. It can be used in ways that are not immediately visible, so they adjust. They speak less where words have been mishandled. They share less where openness has been taken for granted. They remain present, but not fully available to every observer. And while this may appear as distance to those who only measure connection through visibility, it is, in many cases, a more accurate expression of value. Because when a person begins to treat their presence as something that must be placed carefully, something changes in how that presence is experienced. It becomes intentional. It becomes grounded. It is no longer scattered across interactions that do not sustain it. At some point, it stops being about what others expect from you. It becomes about what you are no longer willing to give away. There is a point in this process that does not arrive loudly, does not declare itself as transformation, yet once it settles in, it changes the entire structure of how a person relates to the world. It is the moment when validation loses its authority, not because approval disappears, not because recognition becomes meaningless, but because it is no longer required to stabilize the sense of self. And I have seen how rare that shift is, especially in environments that continuously reward visibility and reaction. Most people are still negotiating their worth in public, adjusting their behavior in response to what is noticed, what is affirmed, what is ignored. But when that negotiation ends, something else begins. For the empath who has moved through awareness, through protection, through experience, this shift is not theoretical. It is earned. It comes after recognizing patterns that could not be unseen, after understanding that attention can distort as easily as it can elevate, After realizing that a self built on response is always exposed to fluctuation, there is a kind of instability in needing to be acknowledged. A subtle dependence that keeps a person tied to external signals they cannot control. And once that dependence is clearly felt, not just intellectually, but emotionally, the desire to maintain it begins to fade. I remember observing someone in a setting where approval was almost automatic, where every expression could be amplified, where every action could be seen and responded to within seconds. At one point, they stepped back from that environment, not completely, but enough to disrupt the pattern. What stood out was not the absence of participation, but the absence of urgency. There was no need to check for reaction, no need to monitor how something was received, no adjustment based on shifting feedback. When I asked about it, the answer was simple, but it carried weight. They said they had spent enough time being shaped by response, and they wanted to know what remained when that influence was removed. That question is not easy to sit with, because it removes a layer of structure that many people rely on without realizing it. Without constant feedback, there is nothing to reinforce identity from the outside. There is only what is internally consistent, what holds without being confirmed. And for someone who is not prepared, that can feel like emptiness. But for someone who has already done the work of understanding themselves, it feels different. It feels stable. It feels quiet in a way that is not lacking, but complete. This is where emotional sovereignty begins to take form, not as a concept, but as a lived state. It shows itself in small ways at first. A reduced need to explain, a reduced sensitivity to being overlooked, a willingness to remain unseen without feeling diminished. These are not signs of detachment, they are signs of internal anchoring. The person is no longer extending themselves outward in search of confirmation. They are operating from a position that does not require constant reflection from others to remain intact. What makes this difficult for many to understand is that it does not produce obvious signals. It does not draw attention. In fact, it often reduces it. The person may become quieter, less reactive, less visible in the ways that are typically rewarded. And because of that, their stability is often misread as absence. But absence is not what is happening. What is happening is consolidation. Energy is no longer dispersed across external validation loops. It is contained, directed, held in a way that does not depend on observation. I have seen individuals reach this point and become significantly harder to influence, not because they resist everything, but because they are no longer easily moved by approval or disapproval. Praise does not elevate them beyond their own understanding of themselves. Criticism does not destabilize them in the same way it once did. There is a filter in place now. Not defensive, but discerning. They evaluate input without surrendering to it. And this changes the dynamic of every interaction they enter. They are present, but not impressionable. Engaged, but not dependent. There is a kind of freedom in this that is often overlooked, because it does not resemble the forms of freedom most people pursue. It is not expressive in a loud or visible way. It is not about doing more. It is about needing less approval, less reassurance, less external confirmation. And in that reduction, something expands. A sense of ownership that does not fluctuate with audience, a stability that does not require reinforcement, a clarity that remains even when nothing is being reflected back. There is a kind of strength that does not need to be recognized to exist, and once it is found, it does not ask for permission to remain.